fear was that there was a killer at large here who could strike anywhere. We knew had already struck in Leeds and Bradford, and was now, striking in one of the nearby towns.
We're with a young officer in the 1970s looking for a killer with the dreadful nickname the Yorkshire Ripper. Police don't know it, but they have the murderer in their sights.
Those 3 lines of inquiry did the trick in terms of identifying the killer.
How does a series of letters from a hoaxer derail Britain's biggest manhunt?
And this was the one that said, you say 8, but don't forget Preston 75.
What does Preston 75 mean? And what dark coincidences make the lead detective believe the crank notes?
Yeah, we've got him. We must have. Something's broken. We've got him. He's going to tell us we've got him. And we were absolutely buzzing. We thought this is we've never been called back before.
And as the hoaxer's campaign intensifies, a police force is blindsided by a new development.
And the whole place was just silent. It was deathly silent. And he went click and played it.
My name's Robert Murphy. This is Behind the Crimes. Behind the Crimes is the podcast that tells you about the biggest or most interesting cases from the people who were involved. Victims, detectives, experts, and sometimes even the criminals themselves. For 20 years, I've covered some of Britain's highest profile crime stories for television news. In this series, I'll be making a deep dive into each case to see how crimes were solved or how criminals managed to evade justice. If you want to see evidence from each inquiry, watch video clips, read more, or get in touch, just subscribe to the Behind the Crimes site, and please do rate and review our podcast. A word of warning, this is a crime podcast. There may be language and descriptions you might find affecting. Listener discretion is advised. This 3-part miniseries describes the hunt for Peter Sutcliffe, who went by the nickname deemed appropriate in the 1970s, the Yorkshire Ripper. This phrase is extremely distressing to the families of the victims, and I have avoided using it wherever possible, but sometimes, unfortunately, it is the only term I can use. This mini-series is called Deadly Deception, Episode 1, The Letters. The first murder was in the early hours of October the 30th, 1975. Wilma McCann was 28 years old, a mother of 4 who'd been on a night out. She lived in the Chapeltown area of Leeds. At that time, Chris Gregg was a young probationary uniformed constable. He wasn't involved in that case, but he watched from afar as the serial killer's list of victims started to grow.
As a PC at Huddersfield, just getting on with my probationary responsibilities, I wasn't really aware of what was happening on the major crime front, over in Leeds. Although we were in the same force and we recently amalgamated, it was only amalgamated in 1974, was Leeds and into Bradford and West Yorkshire Police. Whilst you had passing knowledge there'd been a murder in Bradford or one in Huddersfield, it wasn't my world, really. I was getting on with my job as a trainee rookie probationer, and doing what needed to be done there, dealing with very low-level things like, speeding and parking and all this stuff.
Could you just give us a sense of what the feeling was like within the police force, what the feeling was like within West Yorkshire, what the feeling was like within the country, that in 2 years there were 8 murders?
Things escalated, rapidly from the first murder of Wilma McCann. I don't think anybody, certainly myself and my colleagues, had any sense that this was embarking on a serial killer, spree, a serial killing spree. Far from it. Murders happened. Generally, they were quickly solved. Unusual, really, for a whodunit murder to run on. That yes, they did happen, but they were few and far between. They were wrapped up pretty quickly. There was a sense of this. This is really serious. That there were now, 3, 4, 5, 6 murders being linked that were being put down to the person who was, titled the Yorkshire Ripper, and the early stages, it did seem to be preying on, on the sex worker industry at the time, and it was thought that the killer was targeting that section, that vulnerable section who were, leaving themselves in a position where they were very vulnerable to someone who got his propensity to take advantage of it.
The roll call of victims makes grim listening. Wilma McCann was murdered in October 75. Just 3 months later, in January 76, a 42-year-old, Emily Jackson, was killed. A year later, in February 77, he murdered Irene Richardson. All three were from around the Chapeltown area of Leeds. He murdered in Bradford for the first time 2 months later. His victim was a 32-year-old, Tina Atkinson, in the Manningham district. All 4 victims so far had been sex workers. Perhaps it says something of the attitudes of the time, but the inquiry seemed to pivot in the minds of police and the public when his next victim was not. 16-year-old Jane MacDonald was murdered in Leeds in June 1977. And the killer struck 4 months later, murdering sex worker Jean Jordan in Manchester for the first time. We'll come back to Jean later because clues left where she was found are key. In January 78 in Bradford, he killed Yvonne Pearson, a 21-year-old sex worker. Her body remained undiscovered when 10 days later he killed 18-year-old Helen Ritker. This was when Chris Gregg became involved. He'd now passed his probation and his detective's training and was waiting for a detective's position to become available.
I was back at Huddersfield when a murder happened in, the division I was working in Huddersfield, and it was Helen Ritker, a young 18-year-old girl, and she'd been picked up by a punter seemingly in the Hill House area of Huddersfield behind a timber yard called Garrard's, and it's in a pretty run-down part of town, industrial area, industrial side of the town, and it was known as an area where sex workers would operate, and there were some toilets nearby, and it all had a bit of a feel to it of that kind of world. And the murder had happened there. Everybody knew this was likely to be another Yorkshire Ripper case, and it was terrifying for the public in Yorkshire because over that 2 to 3 years now since Wilma McCann had been killed, and there were now 6 other murders. There was actually 7 others. One hadn't come out at this point. Yvonne Pearson's body hadn't been found, who had been killed just before Helen Ritker. But it's almost hard to describe the sense of fear that was in this part of the world in West Yorkshire. And because everybody was looking at each other, it was all over the news, and the fear was that there was a killer at large here who could strike anywhere. We know had already struck in Leeds and Bradford, and was now, striking in one of the nearby towns. And the alarm, the sense of who is this person? People looking at their own families and their own friends. Could it be anything to do with this? Because nobody knew where this person was from. Were they very likely from this part of the world in West Yorkshire? That's where everybody assumed this person was in the middle of somewhere.
The pressure was on. 7 murders that they knew about and an 8th they would soon discover. The inquiry was led by George Oldfield. He was West Yorkshire's Assistant Chief Constable. He was a veteran of the Second World War, a very experienced and demanding leader. He was feared by many of the force's junior officers. It was his job to coordinate all the separate investigations and formulate lines of inquiries to catch the man who was the country's most wanted criminal. George Oldfield and West Yorkshire Police had the biggest burden in British policing.
The force was in complete, it was not in meltdown, but it was in a high state of stress in every respect, because there were now these various murders running. Each of them had a different senior officer leading them. Each of them had a different team involved, some were moving from one to the next murder. And I remember at Huddersfield, there was a huge team, maybe 100 detectives, who there wasn't a dedicated murder team like now. Detectives had to be drawn from the various other divisions in the force. And West Yorkshire, yes, it's a massive force, and at the time probably had 10,000 officers. But they had the day-to-day work going on in cities like Leeds and Bradford. And to draw out, hundreds, probably 250 officers working on these from the detective ranks, left a lot of stress back at the divisions. They had to send incident room staff. They had to send detective sergeants, detective inspectors. So it's stripping out the whole layers and layers of CID ranks to deal with this, what was now the serial killer case. And it's hard to describe the atmosphere. Fear was underlying everything. There was nothing else that was more important than this case to the police and the public at that time.
And for you personally, as someone who was right at this fledgling stage of your career, to suddenly be part of something which had been going on and been big that you hadn't been part of, but to now be included in this inquiry.
I was 22. It was almost surreal because it was this. The size of the investigation is what struck me. The one thing, and I found it right through my career with major investigations, is once detectives are together, there is an absolute joint determination in the immediate aftermath of a whodunit murder like this. We're going to get this guy. We're going to get this guy, because they're aware of the horror and the carnage that's happened to the person only hours before. And the terror that somebody's gone through, and the determination is, there is a sense of that absolute belief, we're going to get this person. And all the time I was on that case, and another murder happened, that never wavered. It was complete belief. This is the case. We're going to get this person on. All days off cancelled, 15-hour shifts, as the norm until further notice. Your life goes on hold. As an individual, your whole life is wrapped up in that case, literally.
It was only 2 months later that the first letter appeared, didn't it? And that was, if I'm not mistaken, that was sent to police. The first letter was sent to police, and the second letter was sent to the Daily Mirror. Can you just tell us when you became aware of these, and what you thought, and what the thinking was in the force at the time?
I was working in the incident room at Huddersfield when the first letter came in. And I remember it came into the office, into the incident room, in a sealed exhibit bag, which was unusual because at the time everything was letters, documents, phone messages and all the rest of it. So paper was the norm. But this was unusual because people did write in all the time, members of the public, information coming from various forces on telexes, internal systems, so mountains of paper. But this one was in a plastic bag already. So it had gone through the system internally amongst the commanders. And it was now within the incident room. And I remember there seemed to be a sense that this was being taken as an important letter for the reason it was in the plastic bag.
The envelope had a few clues. There was a large rectangular postmark saying Sunderland in the top right corner. So far, Sunderland in the northeast of England had featured nowhere in the inquiry. This was new. It was also addressed to George Oldfield personally. The actual letter, it was in the bag on 2 sides of lined paper, unfolded so all the detectives could read through the plastic. The handwriting was angular with few loops on letters like G's and Y's. There was a slight rightward slant to the writing. You can see the letters in full on the Behind the Crimes website. But this is what it said, and it is grim listening. Dear Sir, I'm sorry I cannot give my name for obvious reasons. I am the Ripper. I've been dubbed a maniac by the press, but not by you. You call me clever, and I am. You and your mates haven't got a clue that photo in the paper gave me fits, and that bit about killing myself? No chance. I've got things to do. My purpose, to rid the streets of them sluts. My one regret is that young lassie MacDonald. Didn't know, 'cause changed the routine that night. Up to number 8 now. You say 7, but remember Preston 75? Get about, you know. You were right, I travel a bit. You probably look for me in Sunderland. Don't bother, I'm not daft. Just posted a letter there on one of my trips. Not a bad place compared with Chapeltown and Manningham and other places. Warn whores to keep off streets 'cause I feel it coming on again. Sorry about young lassie. Yours respectfully, Jack the Ripper. Might write again, not sure last one really deserved it. Whores getting younger each time. Old slut next time, I hope. Huddersfield, never again. Too small. Close call last one.
Saw the handwriting, the sloping handwriting, the spidery handwriting on the original letter, and thought, interesting. Is there another murder that's been linked? And have we got somebody here who's obviously writing to the police about it? So yeah, that raised obviously conversation and interest, but we didn't know whether it was really just another crank kind of letter that was just being flagged up and bagged up for fingerprinting or whatever. We weren't sure. And this was the one that said, you say 8, but don't forget Preston 75. Now, Preston 75 meant nothing to me, literally nothing, but colleagues around the table who were, had been in more senior positions than I were, they were saying it's referring to John Harrison, who had been murdered in Preston in 1975. And we were speculating whether our commanders were now linking the two. And that was it. So I was aware that a letter came in.
What did you think? What were your thoughts?
I was worried because having been in the incident room when the first letter came in, and I read the letter like everybody else did. I saw the full letter. I read it. And what we didn't know at the time was that lying underneath a rubbish tip in Bradford was, we thought Helen Ripker was victim number 7. Victim number 7 was lying under a rubbish tip in Bradford, Yvonne Pearson, who he murdered in the weeks before he killed Helen Ripker. When that became known that Yvonne Pearson had been killed before Helen Ripker, what was thought would have made sense if these were from the genuine killer in the letter, instead of just saying, don't forget Preston 75, if it had said, if you go to that rubbish tip at Bradford, you'll find my real victim number 7, because you're dealing with number 8. And the fact that that wasn't in, if he was wanting himself to be taken seriously, we thought that should have been in that letter. Go and find my other victim that he'd missed, and then he would have been taken serious. And that omission worried people. And I felt there was some disquiet about it. And from the moment we were given the letter postage dates as alibi dates to work on for everybody, we were interviewing, these for West Yorkshire people were interviewing, and handwriting, we were taking handwriting samples from them. It just felt that there was a huge step change in almost belief, because up until that point, we were on it with the alibis. You had to meticulously alibi people, and even, dates, weeks and weeks the murders happened now, where, for example, Josephine Whittaker, the date that she was killed was the date that we would have been alibying for, the most recent one. But then you could fall back on other dates because people, kept diaries a lot more then, and you said, well, and you could work out where people were, and not always, but we'd take people back in time, and we had to take statements of alibi. We had to do everything in a very meticulous way. Once we started being required to also alibi on the postal dates of those letters, it felt it was starting to come apart.
Less than a week after the letter to George Oldfield, an envelope with a Sunderland postmark arrived at the Manchester offices of the Daily Mirror. It's important to note that at this point, police still thought they had 7 victims, but Yvonne Pearson, who'd been killed before Helen Ritka, was still a few days away from being discovered under an old sofa in Wasteground in Bradford, making it 8 in total. This letter had the same handwriting as the last. In this one, the grammar is even more convoluted than the first, and it is difficult to read, both for its poor English and its dreadful content. It said, "Dear Sir, I've already written Chief Constable Oldfield, a man I respect, concerning the recent Ripper murders. I told him, and I'm telling you, to warn them whores I'll strike again, and soon, when heat cools off. About the MacDonald lassie, I didn't know that she was decent, and I'm sorry I changed my routine that night. Up to murder 8 now, you say, but remember, Preston 75. Easy picking them up, don't even have to try. You think they'll learn, but they don't. Most are young lassies. Next time, try older one, I hope. Police haven't a clue yet, and I don't leave any. I'm very clever, and don't think of looking for any fingerprints, because there aren't any. And don't look for me up in Sunderland, because I'm not stupid. Just pass through the place. Not bad place compared with Chapeltown and Manningham. Can't walk the streets for them, whore. Don't forget, warn them. I feel it coming on again, if I get the chance. Sorry about Lassie, I didn't know. Yours respectfully, Jack the Ripper." Might write again after another one's gone. Maybe Liverpool or even Manchester again. Too hot here in Yorkshire. Bye. I've given advance warning, so it's yours and theirs fault. Why was he calling himself Jack the Ripper? And again the reference to Preston 1975. And why did George Oldfield and his deputy, Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, take these letters so seriously?
The links that seemingly made the commanders believe these were genuine letters from the killer were that in the letter referring to Joan Harrison, Joan Harrison had been killed and in Preston in 1975, and the circumstances of her murder were similar in some respects, but dissimilar as well. And so there was, is it connected or not? And again, it's one of those you don't know at the time. You've got to make a judgment call on it. Wilf Brooks, I understand, was the superintendent leading that case in Lancashire. He didn't think it was a Ripper murder. He thought that she'd been stamped on and killed by kicking and stamping in a garage, and it was a robbery. She was a sex worker, and she'd been killed, the body had been found, but it was the circumstances in which her body were found that drew the attention of the Ripper commanders. And seemingly she'd been bitten by the killer, and there was blood grouping from some semen samples that were taken from presumably somebody who had sex with her, but there was certainly a semen trace, which was a B secretor, which was only something like 6 or 8% of the population had a B blood group.
A B secretor means someone who has the blood group B, which is pretty rare. And secretor means that the blood type secretes into bodily fluids like saliva, urine and semen.
The person who'd bitten had got a 1/8 gap between their front teeth, 1/8 of an inch gap between the front teeth. And whoever had killed her had left her body in a little bit of a staged kind of way by placing one of her boots. She was face down on the floor, I believe, and had placed one of her boots between her legs, which was unusual, and had placed a coat over. Now, Irene Richardson, who was murdered in Leeds after Wilma McCann, Irene Richardson's body had also been left in a staged way. She hadn't been stabbed and kicked like Joan Harrison. She'd been stabbed and brutally murdered with a knife and instruments. But interestingly, whoever had killed her had laid her boots on the back of her legs with the feet pointing outwards in a very strange way, and had left a coat over her. So that, again, was a factor that they couldn't ignore. You know, they're scratching their heads thinking, is this connected or not?
In the following weeks, Yvonne Pearson would be found in Bradford. The letters have made no reference to her. Surely they would have if they were genuine. But remember, the last letter spoke about the next victim being in Manchester, and 2 months after that was sent, in May 1978, 40-year-old sex worker Vera Millward was picked up from Hume in the city. She was driven to the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary where she was killed. Had the letter, which was in the public domain, predicted that murder? George Oldfield thought it was genuine. Also, the killer's last few victims had all been in their 20s or late teens. Vera was 40. The last letter said his next victim would be older. Vera Millward would be the killer's only victim before a third letter arrived for Oldfield in March 1979, a year after the last. It read, "Dear Officer, sorry I haven't written, about a year to be exact, but I haven't been up north for quite a while. Wasn't kidding last time. I wrote saying the whore would be older this time, and maybe I'd strike in Manchester for a change. You should have took heed. That bit about her being in hospital, funny, the lady mentioned something about it being in the same hospital before I stopped her whoring ways. The lady won't worry about hospitals now, will she? I bet you're wondering how come I haven't been to work for ages. Well, I would have been, if it hadn't been for your cursed coppers. I had the lady just where I wanted her, and was about to strike when one of your cursed police cars stopped right outside the land. He must have been a dumb copper, because he didn't say anything. He didn't know how close he was to catching me. Tell you the truth, I thought I was collared. The lady said, don't worry about coppers. Little did she know that bloody copper saved her neck. That was last month, so I don't know when I will get back on the job, but I know it won't be Chapeltown. Too bloody hot there. Maybe Bradford's Manningham. Might write again if up north. Jack the Ripper. P.S. Did you get the letter I sent to the Daily Mirror in Manchester? Police were able to run tests on this letter, and a little over a week after it was sent, the murderer would strike again. Clues at this scene, combined with the letters and their reference to Joan Harrison in Preston 75, made George Oldfield sure the writer was the killer.
When Josephine Whittaker was killed, murdered in Halifax on Savile Park, part of the serial killing, she'd been bitten on her breast by the killer, and it was shown that there was a 1/8 of an inch gap between the front teeth. When Ripper letter number 3 came in, they couldn't test for DNA at the time. It was only blood grouping. That's the best they could get forensically. Forensic DNA hadn't come into policing at that point. And the blood group was B secreta, of the person who'd licked the envelope. So all the cards were stacking towards, this is interesting, 6% of the population, B blood group, we've got somebody who's licked the envelope, we've got Joan Harrison's sin. Judgment call was, this is connected. There were other factors as well, which turned out to be red herrings. One was, in one of the letters, the author of the letter had actually referred to Vera Millward in the aftermath of Vera Millward's murder, had referred to the fact that, she told me she'd been in that hospital. Well, her body was found in the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary, and she had been into hospital for a procedure or an operation recently. And it was thought from reading that she must have told the killer that she'd been in hospital. what wasn't put together was that had been in the local Manchester press. It had been in the press that she'd been in, because I think her husband had told the press. And that little thing there, just added weight. If they were unaware of it, which they were at the time, they just assumed that was adding weight to it. So all these things led to the belief that the author of those letters was the killer.
Was there any handwriting analysis done, looking at the structure of the grammar of the language that was used?
It was. There was all sorts of experts were brought in. There were linguistic experts to decide what kind of... there were experts in the handwriting, but then experts about what does the handwriting say about the character. And of course, everybody had a view on it, and there were more experts that were brought in to look at the handwriting. And I think, with the handwriting, it was this person, is a psychopathic nature kind of. It was all coming out, everything to fit. And I remember being in a briefing at Millgarth, actually. Well, I think it was on the Josephine Whittaker or the Jacqueline Hill murder, and there was a massive briefing at Millgarth Police Station with all the team on it. There were 150 or so detectives there, maybe 200, and George Oldfield briefed it. And they were describing the profile that they had from the handwriting. And this wasn't somebody who is not a dangerous person. This was fitting the criteria that this person could be capable of doing something like this. But it wasn't known. None of the handwriting specialists said they thought the person was disguising the handwriting. Not one of them.
June 1979, there was development. Tell us how you found out about that.
I was working on the Josephine Whittaker murder investigation at Halifax. And as a detective constable, we worked in pairs. I was working with a guy called Roy Bowden, and we were going and doing our what we called action. So from the incident room generated actions, which was literally an action on a piece of a form, a carbonated form. You had the top copy given to you as the detectives, and you put it in your file, off you went. And we had within our briefcase all the information we needed. We had all the murder dates, the alibi dates, and so on and so forth, because it was very traditionally done at that time on alibi dates. That's what we were on murder dates and so on and so forth. So myself and Roy, we were doing our work and doing these long shifts, and days got cancelled. Josephine Whittaker had been murdered in April, as you said, Rob, and it was full steam ahead. This was the one we were going to catch, this guy. And we had radios, and obviously before mobile phones and even pages, I think at the time, so we're on police radios. And we got a call saying our normal briefing times are something like 8 o'clock in the morning. We'd brief at Halifax Police Station, and then the debriefing would be at 9 o'clock at night or something like that. And so we'd be expecting. It was towards tea time. It was 5 or 6 o'clock, and we got a call on radio saying, right, from Mr. Oldfield, he wants all the team to report to the courtroom at Halifax at, say, 7 o'clock, something like that. And we thought, yeah, we've got him. We must have. Something's broken. We've got him. He's going to tell us we've got him. And we were absolutely buzzing. We thought this is we'd never been called back before the appointed debriefing time. Something significant has happened here. And this was now an hour away. We thought for an hour, we were driving back to Halifax to the police station. Oh, what's happened? All the detectives are arriving, and it was unusual for us not to have it in the normal debriefing room. So we knew that there must be a reason for this, and there were a lot of people piling in to the courtroom, and it was an old Victorian courtroom. And there was not enough room in the front where the barristers or the solicitors and people sit. So that was all full in those rows and seats there. So myself and must have been 100 others were up in the gallery around the top. So the whole place was packed. And George Oldfield and Dick Holland came in and George Oldfield sat in the magistrate's chair and Dick sat next to it. And they had a tape recorder on a table in front of them, and bog standard of its time, little press tape recorder, nothing fancy. And they had this set up already, and George Oldfield, you could have heard a pin drop as soon as he started speaking, because we didn't know what he was going to say. We'd just got no idea. And what he said that they had received a tape, which he's going to play for us, and that they are satisfied that this is from the killer. And he was saying it in a tone that was very, very somber and serious. And he said, we cannot go into the detail why we believe it is, but you have to take it from us, our viewers, this is the killer. And I want you to listen to this very carefully, every one of you, to see if you can recall anyone you have questioned that has an accent or a voice like this. And the whole place was just silent. It was deathly silent. And he went click and played it. And I'm Jack.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
Next time, the team of more than 100 detectives hears the tape in full.
I could feel almost the hair standing up on the back of my neck. At the same time, thinking, I was straining like everybody to hear it, thinking, have I questioned something like this?
Analysts identify the neighbourhood of the man behind the message.
The experts, the voice experts who listened to this, said the author of that tape is from the Castletown area of Sunderland.
George Oldfield takes the monumental gamble that the recording's from the killer. Not everyone's so sure.
We were eliminating on handwriting and on postage dates of letters. Now, it was going a step further into eliminating just on Geordie accent. So this was the latest directive from the top. This was now becoming, we thought, a little bit dangerous.
And while the inquiry looks at Sunderland, in Bradford and Leeds, the murders continue.
The 3 women lost their lives after that. I mean, the involvement of the hoaxer. Would 3 women have survived afterwards? Nobody knows.
If you want to see evidence from this case, watch video clips with Chris, or learn more, just subscribe to the Behind the Crimes site. The link is in the show notes. Behind the Crimes is written, presented and produced by me, Robert Murphy.